working with API days since the early stage of the meetup. So it's always great to be at that time of the year, not only Christmas. So tonight, super happy. Also, we have Romain working with us on the meetup. He's a more recent addition to the meetup, but tonight he came up with the Kahoot ID. Last month he organized the one with Kinlane for those of you who are here. So yeah, we are the three of us and we rotate every month. So tonight we welcome Augusto, who's straight from the airport, who's the CEO of Kong. Mike. Please, take a seat. Mike, who's on the Open API Steering Committee, and Phil from WeWork, who's building all the API there. So you can give them a big round of applause, not only for being here tonight, but from rushing straight from either the Eurostar or the plane straight to us. So they might be a bit jet lag, so we need to help them being popped up, okay? So prepare your questions. So as Shubham may have said in the beginning, the goal of this chat tonight is to be interactive, okay? It's not only the four of us talking. We want you to participate. So I will break the conversation often, take your question, and so the goal is that you can chat with the three of them as well. We have amazing stories to share, so feel free to ask them anything. Okay, and sounds good?
Before we start, we have someone that wants to talk.
Of course, we could not be there tonight without Algolia. So Algolia has hosted us many times, and this night again. So again, we have given them a big round of applause. It's an amazing venue.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming to Algolia. I feel like I totally belong to this meetup because Algolia is an API. And who here knows what Algolia is? Quite some people, actually. Nice. So at Algolia, we do search, in case you didn't know. But we do it great. We do it good. We do it relevant, fast, reliable. And if you've been searching for videos on Twitch, for example, then you are using Algolia. If you are buying a shirt on Lacoste, you are using Algolia. So yeah, check us out on algolia.com, and we are hiring. Yeah, and yes, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Okay, guys, it's not usual we get started so late, but you know that's can someone help me get an espresso for Phil, please? I think they are in need of caffeine. A third one, please. Yeah. Give us a shot of coffee, please.
I'm gonna get it.
All right, guys. I think what's interesting tonight is we made it on purpose, obviously, but we have Phil on the right, who's building APIs. And next we have Augusto and Kong, who are building more platform for the developers to build great API. And Mike, who's on the Open API Steering Committee. And so they're more helping you guys building better API. Who's in the room using open source tool to build API today? Cool. Who's using Kong? Who knows what Kong is? Cool. Yeah, we're room to grow here. And who's using Open API to describe the API? Cool. Same, room to grow. Cool. And so I think it's super interesting because that's the way we'll organize the talk tonight. So really talking with Phil on what it's like to build an API today. And of course, you need to interact with them. Okay, so you're building API, guys, so please bring your experience in. Maybe, just very quickly, can you introduce yourself? What are you doing? How did you fall in love with APIs in the first place?
I started with an API from the BBC in the UK. Just very interested in how they deal with their program information, but all of their documentation was proprietary. So I started looking around for standards for documentation, and I found what was then Swagger, which about a year later became the Open API specification. And I started building some tools because a couple of my clients were very interested in documenting their APIs, and then I put a couple of PRs into the Open API specification repository. The first one was a missing full stop. And from there, I ended up on the technical steering committee. So anybody can do it.
Cool. And I think what's important in what Mike says is that everybody can get involved into open source. We consume a lot of open source, but of course, every one of us can get involved.
Hi,
I'm co-founder and CEO of Kong, and how we got onto the APIs, it was about 2009 when we were meshing up Google Maps with weathers. So back then, mashups was this cool things for developers. It wasn't really to build infrastructure in companies, but that's our first touch with APIs, and we started a company called Mashape, which back then was an API marketplace, from which Kong came out from.
My name's Phil. I am very tired from flying all day. Let me try and get into the role of this. I came in from New York, but I'm doing some bike racing in Brussels, so I brought my bike and went to Brussels first, and then came on the train here and fell asleep multiple times. So I've been doing APIs for a really long time. I think I first started doing it when I worked for a financial services company, and they had this really complicated, like, not XML RPC, not SOAP, just like arbitrary nonsense. And I started looking to see if there's a better way to do it, and I ended up building a CodeIgniter REST server tool. Any CodeIgniter people in the house? One, yeah, that sounds about right. So I started building that tool and just kind of got more and more into API development and advice, and ended up kind of writing a book about it, just kind of putting all that advice together, and that kind of entrenched me in the API world a whole lot more, and now I'm here forever, I guess.
Cool. Keep the mic. We have two now. Yeah, that's a good topic to start off, Phil. So you, as you said, you've been building APIs for a long time. What has drastically changed for you recently in building APIs?
People are starting to get the hang of the fact that contracts matter a lot more. I'm not just saying that because we've got Mike here. Things like OpenAPI have helped so much because people were just flinging around like random JSON for no reason. I think the biggest thing that people were scared of with SOAP, or that got frustrated about with SOAP, or heard horror stories about, was the fact that like WSDLs were hard. So everyone got really scared of types. And then recently everyone started going back towards types, gRPC, GraphQL. They all focus really hard on types, but we've got JSON schema as well, which does the exact same thing. So we've gone like full circle in the last 10, 20 years, I guess, but we're back to a pretty good place where we're not just flinging around random JSON and hoping it works.
Cool. Yeah, I think who's starting very strictly now, specifying API from the contract, so starting more on the open API side versus the implementation? Cool. So definitely still room to grow. Mike, can maybe you can you explain us how the committee works? Like, what's the life cycle of pushing a new feature in the Open API standard?
Sorry. We have a weekly call on Zoom on a Thursday, which is morning US time, and it's about sort of 5 o'clock UK time. And the calls are very, very, very funny. You should all join. They are hilarious. It's a really good bunch of people. We've got 6 core TSC members, but we have what we call the TDC, the Technical Developer Community, which is everybody who looks at the GitHub repo, finds a mistake, submits a PR, raises an issue. Everybody can get involved, and they're part of the community, and they're part of the Technical Developer Community. The TSC is designed to steward changes into the specification. We're not the authors of the specification, we're the editors, effectively. And I say, get on the call, it's great fun.
Who's contributing to open source here, whatever the project? Cool. Yeah, see Alison at the back. Another kind of open source. Cool. And so, more a question for, still on the Open API, who are flagship users today? Because, of course, a standard is great because it's open source, it's a standard, but also because it's used by bigger companies who can help also make it move. You were explaining me over the phone how Open API v3 has helped people who could not specify their API in a strict way before doing it.
Exactly. Everybody from the Googles of this world. Kong is a member of the Open API initiative. Tyke, IBM, the UK government, Red Hat with 3Scale, Apogee, is now a Google company again. There's about 35 member companies, and they don't directly influence the specification, and the companies that we work for on the TSC, they don't directly influence the specification. We try and keep it as neutral as possible. We're trying to do a good job for all users of Open API. It's not the vested interests of the companies that we represent.
Cool. Maybe Phil, you have an interesting so. Phil is writing up a lot on the web, and so he wrote about 2 topics I loved. The first one is how he's chasing the perfect workflow to build API. Have you found the final answer? Do you think you're at the point where you found that perfect workflow, or is still a work in progress?
Yes, and I'm giving a talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah, so basically I was trying to figure out, like, there's a bunch of different tools that all kind of seem to be doing the same thing, right? You write your unit tests to confirm what bits of JSON are in the response, and you write a bunch of, like, Postman libraries that have a list of all the URLs, and all these things were just writing over the contract over and over and over, and it was really tedious. So people just didn't do half of it, and they had an out-of-date Postman collection, or they had missing tests, or all of this stuff was the same thing. You write the same thing in your serializers, and it's just so boring. So I was trying to figure out a way to, like, have one source of truth that would then kind of cover all of that stuff, give you docs, give you mocks, give you SDKs, give you Postman, give you all that stuff. And it turned out it was OpenAPI 3. OpenAPI 2 couldn't do it. API Blueprint couldn't do it. RAML couldn't do it. There just was missing pieces of tooling. OpenAPI 3 wasn't perfect. I had to build some open source tooling myself, like Specky. But I finally have, like, a workflow that I'm 100% happy with.
Cool. And who thinks you are at the stage at Phil right now? Do you feel you have streamline your flow, or is still a bumpy road to publish every new endpoint in your API? Does it feel like that? Yeah. Romain,
like
you feel more confident, more being on the road of the perfection?
Theoretically, yeah. In practice, we still have some implementation to do, but we're exactly at the same point where we know what we want and where that streamlined flow is perfect.
Yeah. Do you guys have? Yeah.
It is tomorrow at 12:15, I believe.
I think I have it somewhere. It's yeah. You have 2 actually now.
Yeah, I'm doing one about OpenAPI as well.
Yeah. So you have one tomorrow at 12:15. Yeah. In a Blin room, if you want to already schedule, and you have one on Wednesday at 11 upon the OpenAPI specification workflow.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any question, guys, so far? Nope. All is clear. Cool. Maybe so we talked about a lot of the upstream flow to come up with new endpoints, new API, but of course, at some point, as Romain just said, it's also a matter of going to the implementation. And so, thankfully for developers, we cannot only edit an OpenAPI file and hope that everything will work. We still have to make it work not only for one users, but for thousands, millions. And that's where solutions like Kong are coming into place. Maybe Augusto, that would be interesting, or Agi, can I? Yeah. That's more, could you help? Because I think we observe that transition to microservices. So before API were big monolith that people were running, and now it's a bunch of microservices. So behind those endpoints we use as third parties, it's actually a bunch of microservices talking to each other. How do you see that move coming into play?
Yeah, so we see the market as, or tooling as pre-production, production, and post-production, right? So in pre-production, you have the documentation, the designing, the testing, some monitoring as well against testing and the contracts or the specs. But once you're ready to actually have traffic going through, then you go into the production. And in production, usually you have 2 or 3 table stakes, and the number one, of course, is the runtime proxy, where you proxy all the traffic and you had things like authentication, rate limiting. Then you have analytics and logging. And then you have, for some shape or form, a developer portal as well for publishing. Then there is also post-production, which is TBD, but we're investing a lot, where machine learning will come out, security will come out to inspect anomalies of traffic, monetization, if you want to make some APIs monetizable. So it's pre-production, production, and post-production. But what we see, it was, I think the uptake of Kong happened because of microservices needs, where before it was one gigantic API on top of your big application. It was usually a PHP or JVM or .NET. And it was exposing for external facing, so it was pretty much an umbrella. That's how the whole API infrastructure started about 9 years ago. And then as we decouple that monolith into a lot of different services, then guess what? How those services talk, they picked API as the primary way to talk. And it's not just REST, it's also gRPC, there is HTTP2, there would be protocol change. But all these containers that are running then services, they are headless without APIs. So the real value is when they start to talk to each other. So we ended up from having only to manage and secure one API to dozens, hundreds, and in some case thousands of APIs for a single company. And that's where the need of abstracted layer to dispatch all the runtime functionality to the right services start to grow and grow and grow, because you don't have to duplicate common logic over and over again. So the microservices created, as a side effect, a bigger needs for API platform. And those API platform, I believe, needs to be open source, because as you go internal traffic, you don't want to have a closed source black box where you don't know what's happening, and you can extend it, and you can fix it, and usually they're slow, and you don't never know why. So all of that created a side effect on more and more needs for API platforms.
Who's already running as microservices? Who was already started the transition to? And the rest of you are still running monolith kind of application, or you're already in a state of services? Services? Monolith? Okay. Who are the rest who are not raising their hand? An hybrid?
They are serverless.
Yeah. Yeah, Lambdas. Who's running API as Lambdas? Yeah. Okay. A few experimentation here.
Yeah, and are you using primarily HTTP or gRPC or HTTP2? What is your primary?
HTTP. Okay. gRPC. Okay.
Brave.
Cool. And so I think it's one thing is interesting in the Kong model is first the modularity, and I think you're moving a lot of responsibilities out of the dev ends. For example, I think your primary users are more ops-ish kind of team, or operating software rather than building. And the second thing is, so you can really focus on the core logic of your business. So have you seen in all the companies using Kong, like strong business opportunity unlock thanks to that move?
So we have two models, right? We have the open source version, which is the microservice API gateway, is the runtime. And then we have the enterprise platform, which comes with a lot of additional features like governance and security, developer portals, analytics connectors, and more and more. So there are different, a little bit different use cases, and we have different visibility in the two. But for enterprise, for example, one thing that a few years ago was supposed to be huge and never materialized was the monetization. Like, we're going to open up our APIs, and we're going to charge for them, and we're going to become Twilio. That did not actually happen for a lot of large company, but that was the original purpose of API management. Instead, the values start to get internally, right? How you get operational efficiency, observability, and security inside the company. So that is the major use case of business value to get efficiency in the company, rather than, oh, let's find additional revenue streams. There are some cases, but it never became a mainstream. It never became a mainstream use cases, right? If you think back in the days, you have AT&T that opened up their API and wanted to be Twilio, and just because they have AT&T, they think developers will come and use it, and they have obviously a big ego because they were AT&T, and nobody actually used their platform at all because the APIs were broken, documentation was broken. So there is a lot of those examples. Best Buy is another one. That never actually got that platform business where everybody thought this is the thing, and it never happened.
Okay, interesting. Do you guys, who's working for a business mostly operating on API? So the main service you sell is an API? Okay, the rest is more internal APIs you use to make your software speak with each other? Okay, cool. Interesting. Yeah, it's always cool to observe that.
And then there is the partner use case, right, which is not public. It's you open up only to specific. That's huge. That use case is probably 50% of our use cases. That's huge, but doesn't mean necessarily monetization.
I think, so Mike, coming back to OpenAPI, who's using the V3 plus of OpenAPI? Okay, who's using V2 or less? Okay. One challenges you mentioned over the phone, Mike, is So V3, yeah, V3 is out for a big year now, and so adoption is a big struggle because V3 came up with a lot of new features. It took quite a long time for the tooling to migrate. How do you address that issue at the committee?
It's something we are struggling with, I'd say. V2 is capable. Lots of people can do what they need to do with version 2, so they don't necessarily see the reason to migrate to version 3 unless they need some of the JSON schema features or links and callbacks, which were the two big features that got added into version 3. One strange thing happened with some of the open source tools is that they didn't move from V2 to V3. Whether that was some of the developers had moved on and they were no longer maintaining their open source product, or they felt that it was too much work to support V3, or that their users didn't need V3. We're struggling a little bit to find out why some of the best of breed open source tools didn't really sort of come along for the ride in the first 6 months. Phil, do you want? Yeah. Version 3.1 is therefore going to be a little bit of a challenge as well, because we're saying there's another new version now. You've got 2, you might want to keep supporting 2, people are going to be using 3, here's 3.1. But we're trying to make 3.1 very flexible. It's going to support some of the use cases that Phil's been championing through the use of alternate schemas. Roman, we've got a mention for alternate schemas. Yay. And there's some new features coming which are going to be quite compelling, I think. So 3.1 is going to be possibly more of a magnet for open source developers than 3 was. I'm hoping anyway.
I think for the PHP developers in the house, or even Python developers, they're fairly familiar with when too long goes between major versions, right? So like between PHP 4 and 5 and you know, Python 2 to 3 has been quite a hard move. People are still using 2 and they've refused to use 3. I think OpenAPI had that, where there was quite a long gap after Swagger 2 came out, and then there was just like a big gap and a big change, and it was just a big punch in the face to a lot of people that maybe didn't care as much anymore. Because open source developers move on all the time. Like after 2 or 3 years, there's no saying that person's still going to be, you know, working in that language or working in that industry. So I think it was just a big gap, and then people kind of weren't as interested in maintaining, and then they kind of popped back to go, oh, I'll have a little go. Oh, that's a lot of work. Meh. And so like most of the best tools just got completely abandoned, and then that has a knock-on effect, which means that most of the people that are considering getting into using that open API, they then look at the tools and see they're abandoned and say sod it, and they go and use something else. So I think we saw both of those effects coming into play. But luckily, it's had a bit of a renaissance now. There's a lot of new. I maintain OpenAPI.tools, and yeah, there's loads of tools on there. For ages, it was like I was setting it up as a tracker just to embarrass people to upgrade to version 3, right? Because all the tools on there just said support version 2, don't support version 3, just red cross next to all of it. And then eventually, over time, we started to see a lot more tools kind of upgrade. And now I think like 98% of them support OpenAPI 3. I did remove a few that were 2 only, but that's not complete fake news. So things have got a lot better now, and seeing as the TSC are taking such care to not make another like crazy different V4, we shouldn't scare away these new tooling vendors that have just started kind of getting into making stuff V3 compatible.
Yeah, we quickly discussed over the phone with Mike what's the reason they didn't move to an evergreen kind of releases, to have more smaller iterative releases versus a big chunk of work every 6 months. Maybe you can add up on that, explain the reason, Mike.
I did at one point in one of the TSC calls suggest that the minute we had a feature that was minor compatible in sort of SEMVer terms, we should release 3.1. And the minute we had another one, we should release 3.2. That's probably the right thing to do from the specification point of view, but it's a lot of work for tooling vendors. It's a burden for them. They don't necessarily know when a new version is going to come out. It's going to come out, you know, sporadically, and it's very difficult for them to then plan for that. So it's a juggling act. We really need to make sure 3.1 comes along in a timely fashion, but not too quickly, and it's got the right features in it, not just whatever features were happened to be ready at the time. To come back to what Phil was saying about the new breed of best of breed V3 tools, the upside is that some really new, fantastic tools have been developed, brand new for version 3. They may not support version 2 at all, but they're leaving some of the old V2 tools in the dust.
Can you mention one?
Redoc. Redoc's nice.
Who's using Redoc? Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Where is he?
Roman, stand up. Oh, or just lie back down. You do what you do.
Cool. Nice. What and so who's using other standard than OpenAPI, RAML, Blueprint? No. So yeah.
Mashry IO docs.
Mashry, yeah.
No.
Cool. Interesting. Do you guys have any question? Yeah. Wait for the catch box. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It's not Dropbox. Did you guys have been talking about...
Can you speak a bit closer? To
Okay,
the box?
okay.
It's an actual mic.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
clever.
Did you guys have been talking about the new standards, new technologies on APIs such as GraphQL and gRPC? Do you believe that will be the standard over RESTful, or do you believe that some cases that you use in there is space to all technologies there?
Yeah, so they should all be used for different things. It's something I've been kind of trying to teach people for the last 2 years and really struggling with is that if you're doing everything in one way, then you're doing most of it wrong, right? There's different types of API. There's RPC, there's RDA, which is remote data access, and then there's kind of REST, which is kind of the domain modeling stuff. Basically, if you want to just like execute a command on a different server, just like trigger a thing, that's what RPC is for. If you would like to query some information on another server, then that is what RDA is for. REST does both, and then it has a bunch of other layers of abstraction on top, which are completely unnecessary for a lot of use cases where RPC or RDA would make more sense. So those layers of abstraction are designed to make sure that you're building information into the message, into the pipe, so that you don't have to communicate by human words with the developer doing that stuff. So you bake cacheability into the message so that you don't have to then go and talk to the person and say, hey, you should cache this data for 6 hours, and then next month phone them up and say, actually, we've made it better. You can cache it for 3 hours now. You bake that into the message, and they look at it and they do that. You don't have to worry about telling them that the names of messages or anything else or in the data is changed, because you can use JSON schema to put that into the information. So there's a lot of layers of abstraction that go into REST that are completely unnecessary for a lot of use cases, but they're the things that make REST really useful for those use cases. Annoyingly, those are the same things that people have been ignoring for the last 10 years, and they've been making RPC APIs and calling them REST, but it's just flinging JSON about. It's not REST. So that's why people think that gRPC might be a good replacement for everything that REST does, but it's just not the case.
Does it answer your question? Thanks. I was actually bouncing on your answer. I was wondering what API are we presenting for WeWork, Phil? What's the use case of having API?
What am I presenting for WeWork?
Yeah. No, I mean, WeWork as API, and it's not obvious to me what the API's endpoints are for. So what's the main driver to have a public API these days for a company like WeWork?
I think at WeWork, all of our APIs are internal. We don't actually have any external APIs yet. It is mostly just, we have a lot of different systems that do a lot of different things, and we have a load of engineers that couldn't possibly all work on the same thing. I know Google successfully managed to kind of mono repo and have 1 million developers on the same thing, but that's hard for most people. We have, there's a billing system, and there's a system that handles booking conference rooms, and there's a system that handles this, that, and the other, and we just need different teams to manage those different APIs, and that, yeah.
Cool. I remember I worked on actually I lied. I have a use case on the WeWork API. You guys have a partner API, right, to integrate in your marketplace? I think that was the use case at the time. Cool. That's the beauty of API at scale now. You could have 1 million of use cases without everyone knowing all about it. And So more a question for the three of you. So with the rise of microservices, we're moving to, as you said, multiple teams. We're working on different parts of the API. Everything for the end user must look like the same product. You don't want to, for example, I don't want when I'm talking to the marketplace set of endpoints to have one authentication, and when I go to another side to manage another way. So everything should be consistent, but how do you deal, like it's a lost in translation effect, like all the team working in different manner. So how do you keep the API consistent? Maybe more, Mike, how did you see Open API come into play? And Kong, obviously, how do you manage that API, that infrastructure at scale?
I'll do a little bit on that 1 second. It reminded me to add on to the gRPC kind of REST conversation. So something I recommend at work, and something that's quite popularly recommended, it's not a unique approach, is to use things like gRPC for internal situations. So maybe they're your microservices or whatever else. Or they don't need to be microservices, they can just be services. The word micro is arbitrary. We use them for internal stuff or internal within a context. So because we have quite a large department, there's different missions, so different kind of groupings, like mini departments. We recommend that you use gRPC for within those contexts, because a different department or a different kind of sub-department might be in a different continent. And again, we don't want them to have to talk to each other over the phone and coordinate things. So we tell them to use gRPC for that stuff. Internal to theirs. If it's going across a different context boundary, then it should use REST. And if it's public or a different department, definitely has to be REST.
I think you had a blog post on that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can find more online.
Yeah, on adding on that, the way we see things is if it's north-south traffic, so coming from the edge, it's usually a RESTful interface. If it's east-west, then it can be REST. But if you want a little bit better performance, then you go gRPC, which is running on HTTP 2, but not all the time. But usually we divided that. And then GraphQL, usually it's more for mobile, where you want to do request collapsing, because you can't really trust the outsider network, so you try to collapse things in as little as possible and use GraphQL. But behind, you still run a lot of microservices. You run API gateways, and you run from gRPC to REST. It's funny because you break down the monolith into microservices, and then you re-glue it together on GraphQL, because actually I just want to call one thing, but behind there's still a lot of services. So, I mean, software is always fun, but
and so how do you help at Kong making that happen, like to make that both bipolar aspect of thing work?
yeah. So there's a lot of things we're working on, where they're not fully public yet, but gRPC support is coming in the open source version 1.0, which allows Kong to be deployed not just as a edge proxy, but also as a sidecar service proxy. So that's one, and support gRPC on top of HTTP, and we're also working on some GraphQL engine for mobile use cases as well, and also keeping docs in sync. It's another big problem. So because we proxy all the traffic, we know the request and response. We can validate that against a Swagger OpenAPI spec file. So I come from the Swagger world. I've been here for too long. Were you there where we talked for about 4 months on how to call Swagger?
No.
Okay. Oh, you're safe, because I was into that discussion 3 years ago, and it was painful. And no. Yeah, and he's still not entering into. There was like 40 names, and yeah, a lot.
40 different ways to say Swagger?
Well, they had to call it in a different way. They picked OpenAPI spec, which wasn't the most clean and short thing. It's usually best name are 4 letters, 5 letter, done. And then this is like OpenAPI spec. It's good, but there were good names as well. So, but it's good that
you're opening all battles.
But we see a lot of people. Okay, I wrote this spec, put in production, and then things change, and then I don't necessarily update the documentations. So since you are at runtime, if things change in the actual code, you can then auto-generate a spec that reflects the most up-to-date, has the last request of a few milliseconds ago. And then you can validate against your developer portals or your internal documentation that you have. So this is a problem that we're working on to keep production and pre-production OpenAPI spec in sync.
It's really, I think it's I don't know for you guys, but it's a challenge I faced often, we don't want to go as far as documenting everything upfront. Sometimes someone just want to change a little typo, a little thing in the contract, and so having that side of the thing is super powerful.
I'm a very long way from being anything like an expert in microservices. I know nothing about microservices. So I'd like to open this up to say anybody who's using microservices, where are the pain points with OpenAPI usage for that today? Is there anything we can fix? Anything we can make better?
Yeah, I love that question. Does someone has a clue on that feedback? I love the feedback loop in life. Nope. After maybe. Yeah. Yeah. For the catch box.
Thanks.
Good catch.
So we try to implement, we try to implement OpenAPI, but I'm sorry, we went back to Swagger. For one very silly thing, is the code generation. It's because we miss some SDKs, and we have different technologies, and we didn't want to develop for each technology our SDK. And so far, I think there is only, we miss, which one? I don't remember exactly, but we miss one SDK that prevent us to go to OpenAPI. This is the first point, as we are in microservice and we have different languages. And the second point is, it's not very clear for me, but I think we had some features with Swagger that we don't have with OpenAPI, if I'm not wrong, but not sure 100% about that, but
yeah.
There are some stuff about
that. So you've gone back to version 2?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not even that we went back to version 2. We investigate to know if we had to build our contracts with OpenAPI or with Swagger, and we chose Swagger.
Okay.
Okay. And we use, I don't know, we use a tool to document our contract called Swagger Hub, but we are not very satisfied with it.
Okay. There is an open source fork of the Swagger CodeGen project, which a lot of the developers have moved to. It's a little contentious, I believe. But it's worth checking out to see, because that now supports version 3 for every language, every client. So it's worth checking out. But thanks for the question. That's really useful.
Thanks. We had a question, you said, Romain?
Thank you. Okay. I have a question for Augusto about your product. Your product is awesome. And I'd like to know a bit more, if you can share more with us about your vision, like mid-long-term vision. Where do you want to go? Like
Are you a competitor?
Huh?
Are you a competitor?
No, I'm not.
So we've been working for APIs for 7-8 years, right? Before it was called Meche, it was the first API marketplace. We sold that asset, and then we open sourced Kong in 2015, mid-2015, and then we found Kong Inc., the corporation, about a year ago. And it's been a phenomenal journey in the last 2 years, but it's been painful the 7 years before. API marketplaces do not work, but that should be a different meetup on whys. There is a lot of reasons why. But so the way we see the market is, number one, there will be an explosion of services. So we're just at the beginning, right? We had few APIs a few years ago. Now we have hundreds. You have 100 services. I think in enterprise, in terms of vision, we want to be the nervous system of an enterprise, of a large company. Of course, for a small company, but large company have just a larger nervous system. And they will have an explosion of services. And those services might be gRPC, might be pull REST on HTTP, something new will come up in 5 years. But this notion of moving information, I think information can be in 3 states, right? It can be at rest, in use, or in motion. And the part that will present us with the biggest challenge on the 21st century is the information in motion, because majority of information will actually always be moving in the future, or we call it information in flight. So that creates a lot of different problems that we did not have when everything were static. We had data lakes. Now everything is moving from a device to another service, to another team, to a Tesla car, a Samsung fridge. So that world is the world we are driving in. And so we want to build this service control platform that allows you to manage and secure and connect all those services into your organization with partner, with customer, with teams, with devices, and manage and secure and observe them all to build into this nervous system of the enterprise. So that's how we see. And they require different set of technology before. For example, in this new world, performance and speed is the number one feature, is the baseline. It's not even a competitive advantage, right? Because you can have 30 millisecond latency if you have just an edge API going through some partner and coming back. But if you are internally, every millisecond compounds. And so in that case, really you need to be always under 10 milliseconds, whatever service proxy or edge proxy gateway you add on top of your services. So they require different technologies, more sophisticated, more lightweight, small footprints that are expandable. I think open source, as you see this year, is the biggest year of open source. There's been about $65 billion in transactions in open source. Obviously, Red Hat is half of it, but there have been other tens too. So we are at an inflection point where all the infrastructure will be open source, and definitely API is not out of it. There will also be a big part of it. So open source, information in flight, and building that nervous system of 21st century company. I think that's where we want to build this platform on top. And Kong API Gateway is just the runtime at the bottom, and then we will build around and on the side.
This afternoon,
Now I need to kill you, but yeah.
This afternoon, I went to Google and looked at how I could use a Swagger Open API definition and import in Kong. I'm brand new in Kong. My team installed it about 2 days ago, but we used WSO2 API Manager for years. So we're used to this kind of service. And I said, okay, how could I just take the definition of the API and import it? So I went, I saw there is Gelato, and there is another service that is going to end of life. So we use the community edition only. We are not rich enough to pay the enterprise version. So what kind of tool do you propose? Because it's difficult to understand on your website the difference between I saw the developer portal, for example, but it seems to be reserved for the enterprise versions. And so the question is, is it a full freemium solution where you have all the features, like Couchbase, for example, where we have much of the features except the support? Or do you have some features on the community edition and you reserved the full life cycle management, for example, to the enterprise edition? Could you explain that, please?
Yeah. We have an internal TAO, right, where the open source, it's everything that is runtime and production, we put it open source. Everything that is governance and security, like auditing log, OpenID connects, it goes into the enterprise package. Everything that is multi-teams management, like workspaces, when you have a lot of team to manage and govern, that goes enterprise. And also we call it super duper havability. There is a multi-clusters, replications, and caching around the world. That's also some of those features goes enterprise. But everything else goes open source in terms of features. And then in terms of platform, yes, enterprise is a platform lifecycle, which you get eventually from pre-production to post-production, and developer portal is one of those. While open source, following an open core model, the core is the free open source part, which is the API gateway, which is 90% of the use cases are just in getting it there. And then there is a lot of tools open source built not by us, by others, including portals, designing tools that works around Kong, and declarative configs, and so you can use those ones around. But good news is we're kind of like the opposite, right? We have open source, and then when we decided to monetize, we went the other way around to Global 5000, enterprise, large company, large contracts. But also, we will have a Kong Pro version, which is much more affordable, sometimes next year, and it has a good set of features like the portal for a much more convenient price, both self-managed and cloud-based. So that's more for mid-market, and it will come next year. Now I know we're a little bit extreme, right? We go to big checks on one side and then free on the other side. So there would be a mid-level market for next year. But congrats that you survived on WSO2. It's by the time you run a call, it's like Zootopia. Like it's like a DMV in America.
I was going to say my talk. I was wrong before. It's the one on Wednesday. Is the Open API lifecycle workflow thing. That will probably help you out quite a lot because we're in the same position of we actually use Kong. We have the enterprise version. I haven't quite figured out how to do more Open API integration with it yet. But we have been working on all the other stuff. So like trying to have essentially the same functionality as a developer portal and all of the mocking and documentation that comes with that. But without being trapped in any walled gardens, because you have, Stoplight and you have Appomatic and you have various different solutions that do part of what you want, but you don't have anything that does the whole thing. So I was looking for a way that would handle everything under my control without telling our users to sign up for 25 different accounts. Yeah. So I think it will help you tomorrow, Wednesday.
Is it your next company, Phil? Are you starting?
Who knows?
I have a question. I like that talk about the future and the new stack actually. So, simple question here: are we stuck with the API description formats, or what is next? Are we going to write open APIs or whatnot in the future, or what's after API description formats? What do you think about it?
I personally think JSON schema is going to start to take on a lot more of this responsibility. If you're familiar with what Mike mentioned earlier, the alternate schema stuff, that is basically a feature being built into OpenAPI, which kind of defers a lot of the actual data modeling descriptions, so the fields and the entities. It can defer them to other schema formats. So, theoretically, it could support RAML and MSON and the other things that people used to use, but more likely it's just going to mostly be JSON schema, or maybe XML schema for the older folks that like that stuff. And I think JSON schema is only getting more and more powerful, with JSON hyperschema being absolutely amazing. I've been trying to figure out how to do hypermedia for a long time. We always talk about it in the REST community, and we're like, we should do this, but it's hard, so let's not bother. Yeah. Right. It pops up every now and then. It's like the year of Linux. This is the year of Linux. No. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, JSON hyperschema is going to really power JSON schema more forwards. There's some really interesting JSON hyperschema clients being built, so it really is going to be easy to do JSON hyperschema. It's going to be easy to do hypermedia, I promise. And I think that will take some of the load off of OpenAPI, because they're going to focus on the service layer modeling, and so tools can just focus on those, because there's a lot of really amazing JSON schema tooling out there that just works with pure JSON schema, and there's less OpenAPI tooling. So if you can kind of separate those two things and have them just focus on their own bit, then building an API is really, really easy when you find these tools. There's one called OpenAPI Backend, and what you do is you just write your OpenAPI/JSON schema, you design it, and it immediately gives you mocks out of that tool, and it immediately gives you docs out of that tool. And then when you start writing the actual code, it gives you contract testing and payload testing. So when someone makes a request to your code, it will say, hey, this isn't valid. And you don't have to write a whole bunch of code and then also write tests that confirm that the code works the same way as the docs and do all of that nonsense. So I think JSON schema is going to save a lot of the mundane nonsense that we have to do as API developers.
Everybody's familiar with JSON schema? No. Okay, maybe worth re-explaining quickly what it is?
Yeah, so OpenAPI is based on JSON schema, but an older version. So JSON schema, when you start writing everything in OpenAPI under the schema keyword, is basically JSON schema, and you declare the fields and the property types and everything else. It's slightly different. It's basically JSON schema right now is on draft 8, and OpenAPI supports most of draft 4 or draft 5. But not all of it. So there's a few keywords that OpenAPI added, there's a few keywords that they ignored, and there's a few that work slightly differently. And there's very good reasons for all of that, but very long to explain them all. But basically, the idea for version 3.1 will be to add alternate schemas. So you can say, instead of having this OpenAPI flavored JSON schema thing in your file, you can just ref off to an actual 100% pure JSON schema file. And then in version 4, they're talking about potentially getting rid of the schema object entirely and just letting everybody use this new kind of schema format.
So it will be more spreaded definition of your API, multiple files, but eventually you will need to reconcile it.
Yeah, I mean, you should be doing that anyway. Hands up here if your OpenAPI file is one giant file and it's 1,000 lines long.
Swagger can't load it anyway. So
Yeah, right. Well, that's the problem, yeah. So if your Open API file is one massive file, you should probably look into refs, and you can do external refs, so you link off to a different file. That is not going to change that much. Like, you should be doing that now, and then in the future, instead of doing like schema ref, you do alternate schema ref, and you just point to the JSON schema file. So it's more dry that way, and you can reuse those files for really cool stuff. We use them for contract testing at WeWork. So in our RSpec test suite, like PHP unit, whatever, we just reference those JSON schema files, and that proves that our code is completely in line with what our contracts say. And then because our documentation is refing those same files, we know that our docs are up to date because it wouldn't pass the test suite otherwise. And that completely removes the need for tools like Dread, which are like a whole extra test suite with really complicated data setup where effects like cascade through, and what happens in test 1 will affect test 2 and test 3 and test 4. So you think of Stoplight? They're very good. They're really, really good. They have some amazing tools in the pipeline. Prism is a really good mocking tool that is currently being rewritten in JavaScript. And they have an amazing editor in the works, which I can't wait to get my hands on. And they're working on I don't think this is secret. I've been talking about it for ages anyway. They're working on a local file editor, so you can locally edit your OpenAPI and or JSON schema files on your computer with an amazing GUI. So if you don't know how OpenAPI works, you can just do it visually, much like Postman or whatever. And then when you're done, you can commit them back up. That solves a lot of the problems that we have at WeWork, because in this entire workflow of like, here's how you do everything, step 1 is the like to-do, which is you have to write a whole bunch of YAML by yourself. And there's like some editors that will help you get started, but they won't let you edit afterwards. So you kind of create it in one go, and then it's switched to doing tech stuff. But they have an amazing editor that's going to basically allow you to work on that and commit it or do whatever you want with it throughout the entire life cycle.
Is it clearer? Yeah, you were interested in JSON schema. Is it clearer now for you? Yeah, I'm looking at you. Yeah, cool. Guys, I think it's time to wrap up. It's already 45 plus minutes we're talking.
We've been away for 2 days now. So.
Yeah.
I don't know where we're at.
What time is it now? I think first of all, big round of applause for the 3 of them. I think they fought the jet lag pretty well, right? We were pretty good, right? Do you have anything to add before we stop? Like, I don't know, it might be anything you want to ask this crowd. Might be, I don't know, who's inspiring you on the API scene today? Are you looking forward for API days tomorrow? I don't know. Up to you. It's open mic now.
We're hiring.
Who's not hiring? Raise your hand.
Just to answer that last question, are we stuck with OpenAPI description formats? Yes, we are.
Deal with that.
Yeah, until Hypermedia comes and does all the things it promises to do. Yes, we're stuck with them.
Yeah, I think it's a good closing word. Phil?
We're also hiring.
Again, who's not?
I'm not hiring.
So just
Now we're hiring for Kong Studio.
Okay.
All this modeling from.
I think you're staying around 5 more 10 minutes before heading to the dinner. So if you guys want to chat with the 3 of them, they'll be around. Just you can find them tomorrow if you're preparing your schedule. So you can find Phil, as we said, tomorrow at 12:15 for taking a break from dodgy dependencies. That's still the one. We work OpenAPI specification workflow on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Aggie, we can find you for API management is dead tomorrow at 3:20 on the main track.
If I survive.
Yeah, if it's so maybe not. So go to the main track to discover if Aggie survived at least. And finally, Mike, we can find you on Wednesday at 9:25.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, cool. For the OpenAPI tooling discovery and marketing. Then we'll have some colleagues from Screen who will be giving talks as well.
Will be there tomorrow?
Fantastic.
Who won a ticket tonight again? Don't try to whip us out. All right. Come to me if you want a ticket. I just want to check how you can redeem it ASAP. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Now we...
Thanks for coming.
We wish you a great end of the year. Take some rest time with your family. Enjoy the holidays, and we see you in January.